Now, as you open up to Philippians chapter 2, we remember that we are reading a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to a church in Greece. Now, Paul is one of the early church leaders after the resurrection of Jesus, and he is currently imprisoned in Rome. So he's writing to this church in Greece while he's imprisoned in Rome, and he is writing a letter of encouragement, right? At first, he commends the Philippians for their continued faithfulness, for the fact that they not only believed the gospel, but they were actually partners with him in the gospel mission. And he encouraged them, and he told them about his imprisonment, about the chance that he might go free, but also the chance that he may be executed. But the thing that Paul cares most about is the gospel message that is going out from him. And he says, whether he lives or he dies, he wouldn't care, because either through his life or his death, Christ would be magnified. Christ would be proclaimed through either one. And this week, Paul turns to encouraging the Philippians again. And he wants them, the big stressor today, is for them to keep the unity that they have as a church as they continue with the mission. And that's where we begin in verse 1. He says, "So if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, and being in full accord and of one mind." And we'll pause there. There are lots of words jumbled into this one sentence here, and it can be at times confusing. What's the actual point Paul is trying to make? Well, Paul starts with this little phrase, "so if there is any," and that is a rhetorical statement. Paul knows that all of these things belong to the church and to God's people. And so he's setting up an "if there is, then do this," but it's a rhetorical statement. And so it's easier to read this with "since we have," okay? So since we have this encouragement, this comfort, this affection, since we have this amazing love from Jesus, therefore keep going in your work for the gospel, but complete my joy by doing it in a way that is united, by doing it in a like-minded way, where you're not all going in your own directions, insisting on your own ways, but you are pulling on the same rope in the same direction at all times. He points out that division and conflict are not good for anybody. They're not good for the individuals involved in it, and they are not good for the church. And so Paul's joy, as he sees this church in Philippi continue to grow and partner in the gospel, it would be just topped off by a continued unity as they press on for the mission of Jesus. But how do they keep that unity? What's the key to truly being united as a church and as the people of God? And Paul tells us that it is getting rid of all selfishness. And we continue in verse 3. "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others." When we think about the opposite of unity, well, sure, it's division, but the common cause of divisions, they can very often be traced back to selfishness, self-centered behaviors of a person having their focus and their eyes turned inward rather than outward. And so thinking first and foremost of the whole, of the collective, and of the others around you, it's thinking only of yourself. But selfishness, as Paul describes it here, is more than just thinking about yourself. It's more than just arrogance in that way. The selfishness that Paul describes, a selfish ambition and a conceit, it is deeper. It's thinking of yourself as more important inherently than anyone else or even everyone else together. That your ideas are better, that your way of doing things are the only way, and that your comfort, your preference, all of that takes priority over everybody else because you just know you're a little bit more special than the average Joe. This is the case for all humans, right? This is the case for you. This is the case for me. Especially when you're in a leadership position, you always have to check, hey, am I doing this because this is my will, because these are my ambitions, or is this truly the right thing? And there's plenty of struggle that goes on internally for all of us, really. But in the Roman world, especially in these ancient times, it was the societal norm to always be jockeying for social status and recognition and influence. Everybody wanted to be somebody who was somebody. And so the temptation is always there to make yourself something. And it would be so nice if the life of the church and the behaviors of the church were kind of separate from everything that was going on in the culture. But that's never the way it is, right? Culture always tends to bleed into the workings of the church because the people of the church are also the people who are in the culture. And so that little Venn diagram, right, that middle overlapping part, we always have to very closely examine it and say, hey, is this actually something that's Christian? Does this belong to the church, or are we imposing that on the church? And in this case, the temptation was for people to do that. And they say, well, maybe even in the church I can be somebody who's somebody. I can make myself something. I can be a leader. I can be followed. I can finally do things the way that I want to do them. Got construction going on today, huh? All right, Paul is very likely talking about church leaders who have become prominent in their teaching and in their leadership, and probably for good reason. But eventually, two leaders had some sort of a falling out, whether it was a personal matter or it was a disagreement on the doctrine and the teaching and how we should practice our faith. We don't know exactly what it is, but before you know it, rather than everybody just following Jesus, now some are following this leader and some are following that leader. And the unity of the church is hurt through that. When there are different factions and divisions, it's not the best thing. And last week, Paul even talked about how he personally experienced it. He said, while I am in prison, I've noticed that some of these competing preachers have been preaching even more fervently so that they can get ahead, or so that they can really stick it to me in that sense. And Paul said, hey, either way, whether somebody preaches the gospel out of love and eagerness or out of competition, what do I care? The gospel is being preached at the end of the day. Now, that doesn't make those people right? But that's a symptom of that selfish ambition. But we also talked about how there can't be such a thing as competitive preaching or competitive church. We are not in competition with anybody, but we're all part of Christianity. It's just not how it works. So Paul makes another encouragement here to say this is not about your personal recognition. This is not about your legacy or your track record or how many followers you can get. This is about Jesus. And even among the members, it's not about how you can be the best Christian, better than the other, or the best pastor, or the best elder. It's about working together. And if the focus becomes more and more and more about you, it becomes less and less and less about Jesus. So the more that we can check our selfishness, our own ambitions, the better. And just so that we really get it, Paul reminds us of the example that we should always be modeling and pursuing. And this comes in Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 5. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. We'll pause there. So this unity that he's talking about. He says, have this mind among yourselves, which is another way of saying, have an attitude like this. This is how you should be thinking, right? Look at Jesus. We see the best example of how we should live in him. Take a look at what he did. Jesus, he knew how to handle power and authority and leadership. Even though Jesus was fully God, in every way, Jesus is God, with all the power and the authority, with everything. He did not use it to his own advantage. He did not use it to serve himself. He didn't do anything out of selfish ambition. And I want you to compare that for a moment to the prime example of humanity, to Adam and Eve. And as they are in the garden, God sets them up with everything, and he says, don't eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But they were convinced, they were tempted, they doubted God, and they said, if we could just have some of that fruit, then we will become like God. They literally tried to grasp equality with God for themselves. And how did it work out? Not very well at all, obviously. Jesus didn't do that. But we're still the same way, right? We love to get our grubby little hands on any kind of power and influence or authority. And I think it's because we often feel so powerless, because we know that we're ultimately not in charge of anything. You know, God asks us to rely on him for everything because our life depends on what he does and what he gives. And while that is a wonderful thing, and we should be doing that, if we're really honest in our sinful condition, we want to be in charge. We want to have control over our own lives. We want to grasp any power that we can get, because that will bring us a fake sense of assurance that we can change things and do things and secure things. It's not good. You know, if we look at a little example of this, a more innocent example, Hannah and I, at our previous church, we had a family over for dinner in our apartment, and it was the first time that they met our dog, Denver. And Denver's a pretty well-trained dog. Of course, you know, it's all going out the window as she gets older. But as people come in, she's all excited, and I say, Denver, sit. And immediately, you know, she sits down. And their youngest, Simon, he saw me telling the dog to sit and that she did it, and you could just see his eyes lit up. And 5 minutes later, the dog was walking around, and he goes, Denver, sit. And she did it. And you could just see that he was drunk with power because he was the youngest of the family. They didn't have any pets. He didn't have any younger siblings. And for the first time in his life, he was in charge of another creature. And so throughout our whole dinner, the dog would be laying down, and, you know, whether she was thirsty or hungry or excited, she would pop up for a second. He would go, Denver, sit. And she would do it again. And after like 10 times, his mom had to say, Simon, cut that out. How would you feel if every 30 seconds somebody told you to sit no matter what? You would be exhausted. Leave this poor dog alone. And he went, oh yeah. But man, he really squeezed everything he could out of that time here. But again, this is a more innocent example, but that doesn't really go away as we get older. And I think all of us have either met people or been people who want to be in a position of authority or leadership just for the sake of being able to tell other people what to do, because they want to feel the sense that they are the most important and they want to satisfy their insecurities. And have you ever found yourself, and do you find yourself now, with a sense of selfish ambition that drives your desire to be in a role of leadership? Because if that happens, it's one of the ways that you can tell you are not ready for a leadership role in this moment. And you still have some growing, some reflecting, and some humbling to do. Jesus shows us that that's not the way to lead at all. He shows us the true way to lead. We continue in verse 7. Instead, rather than grasping that power, he emptied himself. He made himself nothing by taking on the form of a servant and being born in the likeness of men. And we'll pause there. Now, Jesus, with all his power and all his glory, with all the authority in the world, chose to become like us. And we talk a lot about how Jesus became a man, even though he is God, but we don't too often reflect on the fact that he didn't have to do that, but he did anyway. Have you ever considered how humble that is? And would you ever humble yourself in that way? If you had that much power, that much authority, would you lay it all down? And most of us would have a really hard time saying yes, because, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? We are just not made to have that much, but Jesus could do it. And he made himself nothing. He set aside not his divinity, he's always God, but he set aside his glory as he came down to us. But he didn't stop there. We continue in verse 8. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So Jesus continues to humble himself by choosing to suffer, by making himself subject to the people that he himself created, by being subject to not only death, but a shameful death, a public death, a criminal's death on a cross. Now, why would he do that? Jesus was perfect in every way. He never sinned. He doesn't deserve this. He's God. What's going on here? He had power over all of the people who hurt him, but he did it for the good of all people. Jesus laid all of it aside for the benefit, for the salvation of the people of this world. So long story short, how does Jesus use his power? He doesn't grasp it. No, he uses it for others. And to us, in our human view, it looks like Jesus kept becoming lower and lower and weaker and less and less. And we call this the humiliation of Christ. And it's described really well in the Apostles' Creed when we get to the part about Jesus, right? I believe in Jesus Christ, God's only Son, right? And so we start with this really high view of Jesus, which it should be, right? He's God himself, but then he keeps going down a peg. Who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, who was born, right? Who suffered under Pontius Pilate, who died, who was buried. And as you follow Jesus through his earthly ministry, it is humiliation after humiliation after humiliation that he willingly entered into, from the throne of heaven to being dead and buried in a tomb. And we see all of this as bad. And in a way, it is bad. But we take it one step further to say all of this stuff that Jesus did, we should try to avoid that at all cost. But our human idea of power and authority and leadership, they're all backwards. We tend to think of it as using it to get the most for ourselves or to get ahead or to be the most important, but that's not how it works. True greatness, Jesus shows us, is in humility, in sacrifice, in suffering. And so as Jesus is humbling himself all the way, he is showing us true greatness, not defeat, but victory. He's showing us real strength, not weakness. It's a lesson that Jesus kept stressing to his disciples before he died, because they were always fighting about who was the number one disciple, who was the greatest, who's going to be the most charged, Jesus, when you get into your kingdom. Even their moms started going up to Jesus and lobbying for their sons. And Jesus made very sure that that was cut out. Jesus said to his disciples in Matthew chapter 20, he says, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so with you." People from outside of Israel, foreigners, people who don't know God, that's how they act. But you, absolutely not. "It shall not be so among you, But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So humility and sacrifice take much more strength than arrogance and selfishness. If you want to be the greatest, you have to make yourself the least. If you have to sacrifice, you have to suffer, you have to do what I am doing. Jesus is very, very clear about that. A practical example of something like this would be marriage, right? In a marriage, in a family, God teaches that the man is the head of the household, not because he's smarter, not because he's better, but because that is his God-given role in the world that he created. But being head of a family and having that headship doesn't mean that you always get your way. It doesn't mean that you always tell everyone what to do, but it means that you are called by God to love the most, to sacrifice the most. It means that you are called to become the least as you continue to provide and raise up and protect your family. It's not about power for yourself. Parenting is the same way. When we grow up, our whole childhood, we look at our parents with loathing almost because we think they just love telling us what to do and saying stuff because I told you so, and they just love the power they have over us, and they get to do whatever they want as parents. And then you become a parent, and then you start to know and to realize that your whole life is a constant sacrifice to your children, and you don't get to do anything that you want because you are too busy always doing what's best for the kids. Now, Jesus, in his birth, in his death, in his resurrection, he showed us what all of this leadership and sacrifice and humbleness actually look like, and he did it perfectly. And that's why Jesus is exalted over anyone else, right? We can see that Jesus clearly has true power, true authority. He truly leads, he truly sacrifices, and that's what truly reveals why he is the greatest above anyone. And this is when Paul continues in verse 9. It says, "Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that the name of Jesus, at his name, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of the Father." So again, yes, Jesus is the greatest example. That's why his name is the highest. He is the key to all of this. And one way to prevent selfishness from creeping into our lives and into the workings of the church is to be focused on him. In Hebrews, we read, "Let us run with endurance the race that is before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith." So if we all keep our eyes on Jesus, if we fail to keep our eyes on Jesus and we keep our eyes on ourselves, we slowly start to drift. We drift apart from one another. We drift apart from the mission of the church. We drift apart from how Jesus has called us to be. But if all of us together are looking to Jesus all the time, we find that we will all be of the same mind, that we'll be moving in the same direction. We start to submit to his authority and his will rather than what we want. And our selfish ambition starts to take a back seat. And when we have differences, because it will happen, it'll be not about what we want or whether I'm right or you're right. It's about what Jesus says, and we can be united in that. And it's in this unity that Paul encourages the Philippians to move forward. True unity in Jesus. And so as we wrap up here, I want to ask you this. Whether it's in your family or at work or whether it's here in the setting of the church, has your need to be right or to win or to be someone caused issues for the mission that Jesus has for us? Do you consider other churches or other denominations to be in competition with us? Have you at times been arrogant about how much smarter we are, how better our doctrine is, or how much nicer our music is, or anything like that? Have you ever argued over what ministry in a church should get the most money from the budget, or priority in the announcements of the church, or dibs on what rooms you can use during what days? And do you have the idea that your ministry idea, your big idea that just sprang up, is the only way to move forward if only the other silly people of the church would see what you see? I can honestly say, thank God, there is not a lot of that here at Emmanuel at all. But I have been part of churches where there is competition from budget money and announcements and this and that, and people gloated over how put together our churches rather than others. And Paul urges us that in our pursuit of Jesus, we cannot forget to be humble like Jesus, looking out for the interests of others, to further others, and submitting to Jesus together as we follow his will. Now, I truly do believe this. I believe our church is going to grow over the next few years. I'm confident in that. I believe that people will hear the gospel and become followers of Jesus. I believe that you will carry that gospel to the people of this city as God works through you. And as we do so, I want us to reflect on the greatness of Jesus as we do all of those things in sacrifice and submission ourselves. And this is our word from God for today. I invite you to join me in standing as we move forward in confession